Chinese President Xi Jinping will make a 3-day state visit to Russia beginning Monday, a visit that could have broad implications for the war in Ukraine. It is Mr. Xi's first trip to Russia in nearly 4 years. He'll hold talks with President Vladimir Putin. The Kremlin says that they will discuss their country's comprehensive partnership and strategic cooperation. And China's foreign ministry says that the leaders will, quote, strengthen bilateral trust and deepen economic partnerships.
习近平主席即将对俄罗斯进行的国事访问，将是一次友谊之旅，进一步加深中俄两国的相互信任、相互理解，夯实两国人民世代友好的政治基础和民意基础。
Olivia Xiong joins us live now from Beijing for more on this story. Olivia, what will be on Mr. Xi's agenda during this state visit?
Well, Dawn, we know that this trip that Mr. Xi is making is at the invitation of the Russian president, who Mr. Xi has once described as an old friend. And China's foreign ministry said the objective of the trip is to deepen bilateral trust. And so both leaders are expected to have an in-depth exchange on what it says pragmatic cooperation on shared concerns, and will discuss working together, for example, on the Belt and Road Initiative. But it will be any discussion on the Ukraine war that will be closely scrutinized. This trip especially significant as is Mr. Xi's first visit to Russia since Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, also as China and Russia face growing tensions with the West. Now, what we do know is that the foreign ministry said that the two leaders will be having a discussion on major international and regional issues of common concern. And the last time that the two leaders met was back in September in Uzbekistan on the sidelines of a meeting that was held there. And prior to that, they had met here in Beijing during the opening of the Beijing Winter Olympics. And back then, that was when China and Russia declared this no-limits partnership, which has raised skepticism about this relationship, given that weeks after that, we saw Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. And since then, China has refused to condemn the war and spoken out against sanctions on Russia as well. And so this visit being seen as quite a diplomatic tightrope that Mr. Xi will have to walk.
Olivia, their relationship certainly becoming perhaps more complex, but China is also facing accusations of helping Russia in its war with Ukraine. What's Beijing's response been to this?
Well, Beijing is defending its cooperation with Russia in the face of new media reports that Chinese companies, including one linked to the government, has been providing military equipment to Russia in Ukraine, including assault rifles and drone parts, among other things as well. And when asked if this would be discussed during Mr. Xi's trip to Russia, China's foreign ministry said that the country has always engaged in normal economic and trade cooperation with Russia, and that its dealings are open and frank. Here's what the foreign ministry had to say.
在军品出口方面，中方一向采取慎重、负责态度，一贯依法依规对两用物项出口进行管制。中方的立场和做法一以贯之，同一些国家在军售问题上搞双重标准，在乌克兰危机中拱火浇油的做法，形成鲜明对照。
Now, this also comes as the U.S. has accused China of considering sending lethal weapons to Russia to help in its effort in Ukraine. But this is something that Beijing has repeatedly denied, saying it has not provided weapons to either side of this conflict. Dawn?
Olivia, we understand that this visit comes at the invitation of the Russian president, but Mr. Xi would know that there would be intense scrutiny for any trip that he would make to Moscow. Why has he chosen to go now?
Well, the narrative that China would like to have is that this is a visit by a global leader and a responsible major country. And as one analyst I spoke to said, it's not surprising that Mr. Xi is making this visit now, as China would be looking to want to so-called strike when the iron is hot. with Mr. Xi being seen as trying to return to the world stage after being, in isolation and staying away during the COVID-19 pandemic, also fresh off being given that unprecedented third term as president just last week after at the close of these annual parliamentary meetings that were held here in Beijing. Also, after we had seen China secure this diplomatic win as it's managed to successfully broker this surprise deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, both sides agreeing to resume diplomatic ties after years of tensions, and this role as a peacemaker, something China is keen to step into as it's facing these tensions with the U.S. seeking to portray itself as an alternative to the global heavyweight of the U.S. And we also saw China's Foreign Minister Qin Gang make that call with his Ukrainian counterpart last night, hearing that news from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, as this could pave the way for what we hear to be reports that President Xi could also be speaking to his Ukrainian counterpart for the first time since the war began in the days to come. Don?
Olivia, thank you for that. Olivia Song there in Beijing. Let's head over now to Moscow for a Russian perspective on the Xi-Putin summit. Stuart Smith joins us live. Stuart, Mr. Xi's state visit, it comes amid this new low in US-Russia relations. Is this a diplomatic coup for Mr. Putin, though?
It certainly is, yeah. As Western relations drop off to the lowest point, as the Kremlin says, in history, to have such a geopolitical and also economic weight as China supporting or at least neutral, depending on the issue at hand, is very, very important for Russia. Starting with the politics, to have a country at the United Nations Security Council and within the United Nations that's willing at least not to condemn Russia's actions is incredibly useful. It also means that there is a way for Russia to continue economically in the face of major Western sanctions. China not changing its approach to trading with Russia. In fact, quite the opposite. Trade has increased massively, not just from the Russian perspective, but between Russia and China as well. Just some figures on the economics. Bilateral trade in 2022, while Western trade dropped off or increased only slightly, at least with Europe, Chinese Russian bilateral trade increased by around 30%. Russian exports to China by nearly 45%. And while China remains either neutral or supportive, that's very important for Russia because it means it can continue its so-called special military operation. It continues to have the trade, the access to trade that it requires to fund it. And also it means that the level of pressure is not quite as intense as it may otherwise have been. But going further than that, this meeting is expected to produce new bilateral trade agreements, very important for Russia's stated goal of trying to pivot its economy towards Asia, and also important because Russia and China border each other. And when global logistics are becoming so difficult for Russia, whether that's due to insurance changes, shipping restrictions, to have a land border where trade can be uninterrupted by any changes in the global space, that's really important for the Kremlin. It's made no comment about whether it has or has not engaged in talks with China about military support, but just political and economic support alone is really important and good enough.
Stuart, thank you for that. Stuart Smith there in Moscow.